All right. Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today we have a very special guest, a very special edition of this podcast. Um, we're going to be joined by Fred Moten. Fred Moten, I could give a very lengthy introduction to, and I don't think that he would probably particularly like that, and so I won't do that. But he's a distinguished professor. He's a cultural theorist. He's a poet. An interdisciplinary scholar. And I'm bringing him on because I've always appreciated commentary that he's had on the struggle for Palestinian liberation, on the nation state of Israel. And yeah, before we get into it, the typical silly YouTube things that I feel ridiculous saying, but make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel so that you get the other episodes that we do. We're having a lot of conversations right now about this topic. A couple that I would urge people to check out are episodes with Decolonize Palestine and uh, Palestine Action, because those, I think can really help people both reach political clarity, but also think about what are we going to do? How do we act in this situation? And I think those are important things. Yesterday, we also hosted a live stream with Hanif Abdurraqib and very grateful to him. So check those things out. Yeah. And if you like what we do here, supporting us on Patreon is always appreciated. Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's, an honor, always an honor to be in conversation with you. I really appreciate you making time for us.
Thanks, Jared. I'm glad to be here.
Right on. So, before I move into any real questions, I just wanted to give you space to kind of offer some, initial thoughts if you have them. Today we're talking on October 25th. This has been it's been 18 days since the beginning of what is called Operation Al Aqsa Flood and the brutal retaliation and collective punishment of the Palestinian people that has been a response to that operation. And I acknowledge, like, even in narrating it in that way, I'm falling into a certain trap of talking about 18 days, as opposed to and trying to abstract those 18 days out of 75 years or 100 years of history and struggle. And I think that that's one problem that we fall into in discussing this a lot of times, is this kind of decontextualizing and historicizing, what's going on. Um, but that's the way Western media kind of trains us to look at these things. And so I just wanted to ask if there's anything that you wanted to start with, before I move into some questions, anything that you're want to reflect on or trying to think through for yourself.
Well, I think first of all that, we've got to have a kind of, and I think that we're capable of having a kind of complex vision with regard to the matters at hand. And that vision has to allow us to look at something in very specific and particular local context, but also, globally. Um, And at the same time, we have to look at a particular moment. We have to deal and acknowledge, what Martin Luther King liked to call the fierce urgency of now. But we also have to recognize that now operates and resonates within a longer historical trajectory. And maybe even a better way to put it would be within a within a kind of series of historical trajectories, that we can move out from, 100 years, 500 years, 2,000 years, and we have to be able to account for, all of that and try to understand something about all of that simultaneously. Um, it's not, uh, it's not sufficient to to only look at the present. It's not sufficient to disregard the present moment and the current emergency. Um, and similarly, it's not it's it's not it's not it's not sufficient to pay attention only to what's happening in Gaza, but it is absolutely imperative to pay as close attention as we possibly can to what's happening in Gaza. So
Mhm.
these appear to be contradictory, imperatives, but in fact it's necessary for us to inhabit those contradictions, and we ought to have the intellectual and ethical, wherewithal to inhabit those contradictions. And we ought not let ourselves off the hook of that work and of those necessities. Um, and so, with that said, you know what has unfolded over the past 2 weeks in the wake of Al Aqsa flood is utterly incommensurate with any judgment that any body might have or want to have about Al Aqsa flood. Um, and I think that the most vicious and, you know, uh, clear sighted commentators who are in favor of Israel's collective punishment have already admitted that it is incommensurate. They care nothing whatsoever about the uh, sorry, I always this is a podcast, so I just got to make sure about how much of my vocabulary I can actually use. But so I think I get to say the, a lot of my technical language is profane. So I'm hoping I can.
No,
Okay,
that's all good. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so they're like, yeah, we don't care about these bullshit formulations about proportionate response, right? Okay, we have no interest in a proportionate response, right? Okay. And of course, but to even think about the language of response, right, requires us to say that at the very moment that we begin to think about this in terms of an action and a response, that's when we have to say, no, but there's a historical context here, right? Okay. So this is why this kind of, I don't know, I guess the word I would use is this sort of complicated binocularity we have to have in terms of how we see these things. It has to be operative at every moment, all the time. Okay. So, okay. But I'm acknowledging, and I think it's, without, and and we can get to the whole question of passing moral judgment on shit in a minute. But I'm acknowledging, right, on some level, the initiatory force, let's say, of Al Aqsa flood. Okay. And to acknowledge that initiatory force is necessary, it seems to me, because then it allows us and requires us to consider the absolute genocidal and colonial brutality of the so-called response. Okay. And the absolute incommensurability and the absolute disproportionality of the response. Okay. And then almost immediately, one has to join the evil, apologists for the Israeli response and say that on a certain level, um, proportionality and commensurability are irrelevant. Okay. Because, for instance, if we considered Al Aqsa flood, right, okay, as a response, let's say, to 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 the occupation, okay, and to the genocidal removal and the colonial exclusion, right, that has occurred over the past 100 years, we would say, well, it was profoundly disproportionate too, but in the opposite direction,
Right.
right? It was minimal. It was beneath minimal. Okay. Now, it ought to go without saying, but I guess it no longer does go without saying, right? Because of the utter sort of, ethical bankruptcy within which liberal discourse seems to operate. It ought to go without saying that when I say that Al-Aqsa flood as a response is minimally disproportionate rather than maximally disproportionate. It ought to go without saying, right, that I am not advocating, um, the whatever whatever the beheading of children, real or imagined, the kidnapping of old people, right? It ought to go without saying. Okay. Matter of fact, it definitely ought to go without saying for those of us who actually care about justice. It probably ought not go without saying for the people who administer, state brutality. Okay. They probably should have to be made to say that, yes, in fact, we don't like to kill babies and we think that that's wrong. Okay. But for those of us who have been fighting, constantly, you know, their continued insistence upon their right to kill babies, okay, in a myriad of different possible ways, right? Right? Because we kill babies in all kinds of ways in the United States of America. We shoot them, okay? We bomb them, we starve them, okay? Right? We send them to shitty schools, okay? Right? Okay? We subject them to environmental degradation. Okay, right? Okay. They
Right.
should have to be the ones to say, okay, you know, we think killing babies, no, no, because we I believe that we've already proven, right? And when I say we, y'all know who I mean. We, us. We're talking amongst ourselves now. I'm not talking to Biden. I'm not talking to Netanyahu. I'm not talking to Obama. Okay, all right. I'm not talking to Madonna or I don't care. I'm talking to us. I believe that we have already established that we don't like to see babies killed. Right? Okay. Okay. So But but evidently, right, within the degraded field that people call the field of public discourse, somehow it's incumbent upon us, right, the defender of babies, to say, oh, we don't that this particular moment requires us to say that. Okay, okay, I'll say it. I'll say it. I don't like to see babies killed. I don't like to see old people kidnapped, right? And and when I say I mean it in this sort of trans-historical sense. I haven't liked that for a long time. We haven't liked that forever. We've never liked that. We've never been okay with that, right? Okay. Okay. So, I guess I'm just at this point, you know, I think that there's a lot of careful parsing out of our speech that might even be useful for us to do. And I guess it's definitely necessary for those of us who feel what I guess is in some ways the legitimate compulsion to speak, or even the legitimate compulsion to follow or to heed the call of others who ask us to speak, right? But I also think that we need to pay some attention to the question of how we speak, to whom we are speaking, with whom we are speaking. Okay. I think we need to be able to make a distinction between the making of statements, okay, and the ethical practice of thinking and studying together, okay, in the face of the common malady that we are confronted with. You know, um, I think that over the last 2 weeks, many people have felt compelled to speak, okay, to make statements. And I think now we need to follow a different compulsion, which is to talk with one another, to study and think with one another, and to think with regard to a specific question, which is how do we renew and refine our anti-colonial practices? So that's why I'm here today. Um, I'm not here to make a statement, but I'm here to hopefully be involved in a conversation with you and whoever else is out there. How can we renew and refine our anti-colonial practices?
Right on. Um, and so one of the reasons that I, asked you here, not, I mean, there's a million reasons I could ask you here. I love talking to you, Fred. But um, you have there was this discussion, and I know that even this discussion is part of what you're saying, and it comes out of other work you're doing because you had this conversation with Robin Kelly and Afua Cooper and Ronaldo Walcott in Toronto back in 2020, I believe, is when it happened. No, that's not right. It was back before that, 2017 or 2016, something like that. Um, and you know, there's several points that you make there that I think are important for folks. And, I want to also get to think more of what you're thinking about now because I realized that was what you were thinking about 6 years ago. And I think that I'm sure what you're thinking about now is also a little bit different. But there are a couple points I think are worth us revisiting in these times because there still manifests so prominently within society, and people still have to especially folks who may be newer to thinking about this issue deeply, or haven't studied as much, they run into these things, right? And so one of the things that people run into is um, this conflation of criticism with the state of Israel uh, as an act of anti-Semitism, or that somehow anti-Zionist Jews are self-hating, that they're anti-Semitic for being anti-Zionist and Jewish, right? And then obviously that applies to everybody who's not Jewish as well. But even in this moment, we're seeing large groups of comrades of anti-Zionist Jews standing up and being denounced by people like the Anti-Defamation League and things like that. And so, um, I think that one of the interesting discussions you had was this comparison, thinking about Israel, and the anti-Semitism of the creation of the state of Israel, or I guess you called Israel an artifact of anti-Semitism, European anti-Semitism to a certain extent, and you talked about that in relation to Liberia and Sierra Leone. And I wondered if you could revisit that a little bit, and if there's anything that you've seen or that you've thought about in relation to this recently.
Well, it just seemed obvious to me, and I have not had any occasion to reconsider the obviousness of it, that the kinds of colonization schemes that were invented by the British, by the Americans in the 19th century to remove and exclude Black populations that had already been forcibly removed and excluded, so that in order to provide, so to speak, their presence in the United States and in Britain, uh, that those schemes are, manifest um, instances of a kind of, state-sponsored, state enacted anti-blackness. This is not. I don't believe that these formulations are controversial. Um, the anti-blackness is redoubled because the colonization schemes have no interest whatsoever in what the impact of those schemes might be on the people who are, as it were, native to the zones that would be then colonized. And they were called colonization schemes. They were explicit about the use of that language with regard to Liberia, with regard to uh, Sierra Leone. Even you know, Lincoln's preferred scheme, which is to ship folks to Nicaragua, it would have been of another order. But certainly, what we might call the indigenous populations, which would then be impacted by the return of displaced indigenous peoples to those populations, right? In some instances, it could be called a return. In other instances, it would just be more technically precise to call it a removal. The impact on those indigenous populations was of very little concern. Okay. Um, I really don't understand. I've never heard, I don't know that there could be an argument that would imagine that the schemes, the Zionist schemes that Theodore Herzl began to put forward, in the late 19th century, and that were in some sense sanctioned, by the British elite, especially Balfour, Churchill, I mean, none of whom I think, and I really don't think it's controversial to to speak of Churchill's or Balfour's anti-Semitism. You see what I'm trying to say? It's like I think it's relatively straightforward that these schemes of colonization and removal and return within the African and let's say Afro-diasporic context, it's not difficult. It would be difficult, in fact, to try to make an argument about how these things would be other than how these things could be seen as other than anti-black. Similarly, right? I don't know how it is that the British involvement and then subsequently the American involvement here can be separated from the anti-Semitism that has always been interested in how it is that the idea, the fantasy of something called Europe, right, can be cleansed, right, can be protected, right, from what has always been seen as the 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 the, the contaminative, destructive, invasive force, okay, of Judaism and the Jewish people. Okay, it, these things just simply seem obvious to me, right? And it doesn't matter that you can say, yes, well, there are all kinds of complex forms of incorporation and of extraction and even of limited modalities of welcoming. Yes, of course. Similarly, right? Africans were visited with these same contradictions, right? I mean, and in fact, and we can see how those same contradictions manifest themselves in contemporary Palestine now. The operative phrase, which I first heard in the work of two Israeli thinkers. Well, I think she probably would bristle at being simply called Israeli, and I wouldn't want to disrespect her in that way. But Ariella Azoulay and Adi Ophir, they speak of what they call incorporative exclusion. Okay. And again, we could see these models of colonization as forms of incorporative exclusion, right? Where extraction and exclusion go hand in hand. They work together, right? And they have always worked together in the long history of colonial war, in the long history of the war of conquest, in the long history of the war against subsistence, right? These are these things just don't seem that controversial to me. Okay. So but it seems like it's just really counterintuitive for some people to imagine that Israel can be an artifact of anti-Semitism. Well, I that doesn't seem counterfactual or counterintuitive to me. It seems again pretty obvious. Does that mean that everything that happens in Israel is an extension of that anti-Semitic ideal? Okay, an idea? No, no, it doesn't mean that at all. Does it mean that every Jewish person, or that even every Jewish person in Israel, is somehow both extending that anti-Semitism in their daily lives and also extending it in the very real ways in which their presence there can't help but be involved in coloniality? Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that. We ought to be able to think about things that are a little complicated in a somewhat complicated way. Okay. But then some shit is actually simple too. Okay. So this seems to me to be relatively simple and relatively straightforward. And what it means okay, is that you can be deeply, deeply anti-Semitic and still support Israel. and there's hundreds of examples. There should be a rogues gallery of mugshots that comes before our mind's eye, right? When we see or think of such people. Okay. When we take into account that possibility. Okay. And by the same token, I think it's also possible and not only possible, but absolutely necessary, okay, to say that we are against the existence of the state of Israel, okay, but that is not tantamount to anti-Semitism, and that in fact it might even be a fundamental element of a resistance to and a refusal of anti-Semitism. Right? This to me is again not a counterintuitive and not a counterfactual, possibility.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, as you were talking about this group of anti-Semitic people that are, profoundly in support of the state of Israel, it brought to mind we had a discussion. I think it was 2 weeks ago now with Morgan Archukina, and she brought up that there are more members of Christian Zionist organizations in the United States than there are Jewish people in the United States, and I think that that's a if that's a profound point that we should sit with and think about too, in terms of the impact of the policy and the demands of folks in that camp as well, and our own settler colonial right wing Christian nationalisms and things like that as well. And so yeah, I appreciate that point. Um,
I mean, I just think
so
that
yeah, go ahead.
one, sorry, but one of the, and I think I said something like this that night, with Robin and the other folks, is that to me one of the most egregious examples of this kind of pro-Zionist anti-Semitism is the way in which it makes Israel stand in for the principle of settler coloniality, as well as the principle of the nation state. What it means to carry that weight, to carry the banner for maybe the two most destructive ideas in the history of ideas, right? Is pretty intense and pretty profound. And no 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 people should be made to carry that weight. Okay. Um and Yeah, it's an
Yeah,
unsustainable weight. It's an unsustainable weight. It's a weight that requires that people to literally, as it were, constitute something of a dam against the motion of history, right? And
that's a
yeah.
good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, just the dam against the motion of history. I mean, that is in some ways it feels very um I don't know, that metaphor fits very well, I think, for this current moment of you see the sort of Western world trying to prop up the dam against the flood of people who are just saying, no, like you can't continue to keep Palestinians in concentration camps and, you know, keep them out of their lands, and yeah, and I mean, you certainly see not so much in the States, although some maybe, but not so much in the States in, the Middle East or, what gets called West Asia or whatever. But the people, when you see rallies in Yemen or Jordan or Syria or Lebanon, or Egypt, it's just quite clear that, the masses are very much with the Palestinian people and, desperately asking their states to to step in and help, basically help the Palestinians in the struggle.
Well, but I have to say something here too now, and I think it's a kind of mirror image of this last statement, right? I think that all of us who seek to move within the flow, of history, you know. If we believe that, as King used to say, again, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That if we believe that that's the 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 motion that history takes or should take, you know, then we also have to ask some questions about what it means for us to allow ourselves to require the Palestinians to stand in for that too, right? In other words, and this is to
Yeah.
me is about the difference between expressing solidarity for their anti-colonial practice and actually joining their anti-colonial practice where they are with the anti-colonial practices that we engage in wherever we are,
Right on.
right? They can't be made to stand in for the principle of anti-coloniality, okay? Because they can't bear that weight either,
Right
okay?
on. No,
And
that's right.
and at that point it becomes something where it's about something more beyond, if you will, solidarity. And deeper still, it's way beyond the mere expression of solidarity or a statement of solidarity, right? So,
Yeah, right on. I want to just for fun say hello to some people that are here in the chat. Some good folks from the study group, folks from different organizations. Um, and let me see, Dubravka, good morning. Um, and we'll pull up a couple questions from folks in the chat later on today. Peace, Jared. Um, and yeah, but just wanted to say some hellos to folks. Um, so another thing we should talk about, and again, like this in some ways, I apologize that some of these questions are probably a bit elementary. I know they are to you, but I know that these are things that people deal with, right? And so I want to help arm people with thoughtful responses to some of these things, and I know you have that you have those. And so one is, there's the right to exist, which you address in that discussion. I don't see that as, I mean, it still comes out. I don't. I feel like a lot of people realize that that's not a thing. But be that as it may, that there is a discussion a lot right now of the right to defend itself, which I think is particularly, as we talked about the disproportionality earlier on in this discussion, the idea that that a colonizing power that is, engaging in this siege, that's denying, food, water, and fuel to people as it's bombing them, that this constitute a mode of self-defense, I think, has to be one of the most egregious formulations possible of what self-defense could mean. Um, but I think that the other thing about that is that yeah, maybe just I'll just say that there. But there's a quote that I do always think of with you around this, which is that settlers always think they're defending themselves. It's why they build forts on other people's land, and I always just appreciate that. And it came to mind recently too, as like other forces are engaging and drone striking and trying to send missiles at US military bases in the Middle East right now, and it's sort of like, well, how did they get there? Right? Like what you know, how do we find us in this place where people don't like that we're here? So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say anything on either of those points, but yeah.
I mean, well, now, to hear that phrase, you know, maybe the key word is the always, the, they always think they're defending themselves. And they're always defending themselves. They have always already decided to present themselves in such a way as to require that kind of defense, right? You know what I mean? Like they, aggressors require defense at all times. I mean, this thing of what it means to always be, you know, I mean, just even think now we have a Department of Defense. Why? Why are you always in this? Why are we always in the need? Why do we always have to be defending ourselves? Well, because you're
It
always attacking people. That's why, right? That's kind of why. You know, um, you're always acting in such a way as to require defense because you're always fucking with somebody all the time. I mean, so
yeah.
so there's that part of it. Um, you know, uh, I feel like this well, so there's a couple things. What is the nature of this of a sovereignty that must in fact be aggressive, right? What is this notion of both personal sovereignty as well as national sovereignty that has embedded in it at its core, right? Uh, both the impulse and the assumed right to aggression, right? That's why is it that we seem to be committed to a model of both personhood and political form that enshrines this the aggressivity that then must in turn always defend itself, right? It's okay. Um, that's a question that we could ask, and obviously we would ask it from the position of someone who imagines the possibility of an alternative. Okay. And then there's just the very idea of a right to exist. Um, there's I don't believe that the right to exist has a right to exist. Like the very
Right.
idea is is kind of an indefensible idea, you know? Um, uh, it's an aggressive idea, right? It's I don't know. I mean, I don't want we don't have to try to turn this into a pseudo philosophy class because which is the only kind of philosophy class that I could ever hope to teach because I'm a pseudo philosopher at best, but it makes me want to like dig into the etymology of exist,
Mm,
um
mm.
it's a you know um I I
Yeah.
I think maybe I'm not even and I'm not comfortable with the idea of rights either for that matter, but if I was going to assert a right, maybe it would be the right to insist, rather than exist, but yeah, I think that all of these concepts, the right to exist, the right to defend itself, um, that they in some complicated ways are predicated on a prior assertion of right, and that is the right to be aggressive, the right to invade, right, the right to overwhelm, okay, the right to displace, okay, you know, and 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 that's a right that we must refuse, okay. We have to refuse it when it is asserted against us, but we also have to refuse it in the sense that it can never be a right that we choose to claim.
Mhm.
Okay. And you know, um, states don't have rights. Okay. They certainly don't have a right to exist. Okay. And I'm of the opinion, at least, that everything is better. Everything will have been better when states no longer exist. Okay. And again, I think it's extraordinarily unfortunate for the Jewish people, okay, right? Okay, that they are tied ideologically, okay, most of the time by people other than themselves, okay, to the existence of a state that stands in for the state's right to exist, which is always already a colonial right, okay? And I believe that it is absolutely imperative on us who support the idea and the necessity of justice for the people of Palestine to make sure that they are not made to stand in for any such right themselves. Okay. So,
Yeah, right on. I appreciated, when we talked to Fathi from Decolonize Palestine, he said, first he said it's not a thing. He also said, "What is this right to exist?" He said, "Not at my expense." And I think that's the thing, with all of this. I mean that, yeah, within any formulation, you know, uh, yeah,
but
we,
it's a we it might very well be the case. I mean, I believe that one question we should ask ourselves would be, what if existence is always at some other's expense? Okay. What if that is just baked into the nature of existence? Okay. Which is to say that what's baked into the nature of existence is already a division between something like a self and something like another, right? These are, and it's why the X, the EX in exist is so potentially problematic, because it might very well always already have been aggressively outward in its orientation, right? Okay. And this is why, but these are semi-technical questions about the terrible relay between being and existence that we might want to, that eventually I guess they do have something to do with the matter at hand, but we'd have to talk about that for a long time. And it would end up, I think, having an impact on 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 how we talk when we talk amongst ourselves, and what we claim, and what we desire, what we learn to want, you know. So
right on. I want to pull in, so I have a couple other questions, but we've touched on a lot of what I wanted to kind of make sure that we got to. So I'm actually going to pull in something from the audience. So Nadine here asks, she said, "I am asking myself, after a sustained and consolidated effort to evacuate the humanity of Arabs through every colonial instrument, what combination of words can prove our humanity now?" And I think this gets a little bit to this discussion, you had and I had. I mean, it, I remember in 2020 we were talking, and it was around the time um, that Amazon was putting Black Lives Matter when you turned on your TV, and and the like the proliferation, and people were, these corporations were using the word solidarity, which is a fascinating appropriation of language, because that's, I mean, I think, you know that word has been so evacuated now of what it should mean. um but I mean, I think that this is the complicatedness of speaking and not speaking. And you and I were talking, we exchanged an email before this. Initially, you weren't sure that you wanted to do this because of, the frustration that you had with a lot of the speech that's out there as well. But at the same time, you did come around to, I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth. You can clarify for me, but that you wanted to talk about it, right? And the difference between getting together and having conversations and talking about these things versus the need to make declarative statements.
well, it's like well, couple things. Well, everything. Look, any statement that anybody's going to make right now, if we're honest about it, it ought to begin to feel inadequate about 5 or 6 minutes after it was uttered. Like I don't have any, you know, maybe it's just a quirk in language. Maybe there's a kind of weird, problem with the very idea of a statement. That it appears to indicate something definitive when it can't indicate something definitive. Maybe all statements are, without us knowing it very well. It's just a kind of weird, particularly perverse subset of the larger field of what we might call of questions. you know, um, maybe all of these things that we say ought to have a question mark at the end of it, just to indicate that they're tentative and that they're necessarily imperfect, and to indicate that they must be followed by another statement. We could call this something like the emancipation of the dissonance of every statement, right? Like a musicologist could say, well, what's a dissonant note? A dissonant note is just a note that needs to be followed by another note. Okay. So the one thing we know about all these statements is that they need to be followed by another statement. Okay. That refines the previous statement, or that undermines this previous statement, or that defines the previous statement. It's all tentative, right? And the question is, what's the intention, behind the statement? What are you trying to get to? What are you attempting to approach? Okay. What desires are you driven by? Okay. Um, and I believe that if we could kind of, you know, ask those questions, particularly the questions about desire, then we could give each other a little bit of a break, right? When it turns out that the statements, which we already knew were destined to be inadequate, when they turn out to be inadequate. Okay. Let's give, yeah, you know, we were trying to, the problem then becomes the seriality of the statement, right? My statement has to follow somebody else's statement. Well, maybe we need to try to figure out a way to create some kind of counterpoint here, right? Not counterpoint in the sense of argument or disputation, but rather just a different level of harmonic complexity, so that in a way we can figure out how to regulate, if you will, and to work with this the necessity of talking with each other at the same time about this stuff, right? Not having to, it's we have to figure out how to talk with each other about things. We have to refine that. It's like my friend Manolo Callahan, and I'm always got this impulse to mention the names of the people whose thoughts have influenced me. And I almost feel like I don't want to do that today, because I don't want to feel like I'm making them responsible for whatever crazy shit I'm saying that's going to end up inevitably being wrong. But it is like Manolo would say, we have to renew our habits of assembly, right? We have to refine those habits and learn. We have to keep learning how to talk to each other, keep learning how to get together with each other, you know. Um, and I believe it's important to spend most of our time when we're talking with each other outside of the necessity, okay, of addressing um silly shit, or feeling the necessity of uh, being involved in some impossible discursive imperative. Like, for instance, proving your humanity. You can't prove your humanity. So the best thing to do is to stay away from people to whom you must prove it. Okay. Don't talk to them. Whatever you say to them should be a lie. Okay. As far as I'm concerned. I'm not, there's no utopian space in which we never have to deal with them or their effects. But what we don't have to do is argue with them on their own ground. And it turns out anyway that at least 99% of the evil shit they do to you is not because they don't think you're human. It's because they know that you are,
Right.
right? Okay.
Right.
They know how much it's going to hurt. They know how much it's going to damage you. Okay. They know the pain it's going to make you feel. Then reason they know it is because they sort of know how they would feel if somebody did that shit to them, right?
Mhm.
They know that it's going to fuck you up, what they're getting ready to do to you, in a way that it wouldn't fuck up a dog or that it wouldn't really fuck up a fish, right? So their brutality is generally not a function of their, you know, of their belief in your inhumanity. It's a function of their absolute certainty of your humanity. Okay. The
Right.
Israeli defense minister was clear in, it can be complex, right? Well, we're going to not, no water, no electricity, no fuel. We're fighting human animals is what he said.
Right. Right.
Okay. But he didn't say inhuman animals. He said, yeah, we're going to, yeah, we're going to do, yeah. Right. So look, I mean, I can't prove my humanity. Okay. I don't want to prove my humanity. I'm leery of humans, right? I see we live, right, within the in the wake of the brutality of what humans do. Okay. Um, I'm much more interested in the idea of species reassignment, okay, than species confirmation when it comes to the human. You know, I'm pretty sure that the capacity of that set of differences that we reduce, right, when we place the name human on it, right, that the capacity for that set of generative, interesting, sometimes beautiful differences to maintain itself on the earth, okay, will have been, if it maintains itself on the earth, it will have been a function of our detachment from the idea of the human rather than our fulfillment or our confirmation of the idea of the human. Okay. So if the motherfuckers want to say I ain't human, fuck you. Fuck, you know, I mean, you know, uh, no, 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 no. And and as far as the statement thing is concerned, look, I mean, you reminded me of something that we said, years ago about the statement being what the bad breath of whiteness or something like that.
The you said the bad breath of the white world is what you said. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, but it didn't stop me from signing on to statements, right? In this present moment. I couldn't stop myself. Maybe it was like a moment where my humanity sprang up to bite me in the ass and to persuade me yet again to do the wrong damn thing. Okay. I mean, I signed a statement and please, I'm not denouncing the people who write the statements or come up with the statements. I understand the impulse. I have the impulse myself, you see,
Mhm.
right? Um, but I signed a statement, artist statement, and I was like, okay, I signed it. Okay. So I'm not denouncing it from the position of someone who was above it. I signed it. And if you catch me at the wrong moment, a week from now, I might sign it again, you know. Um, but statement was like calling upon art institutions to speak out against the violence that's being perpetrated by the Israeli state. And I'm like, um, I- I- I'm like, I don't want the Guggenheim to say something
Right.
about. I don't. They can't. I don't want them to speak for me when it comes to this. I don't want
Mhm.
the Tate Modern to speak for no, 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 no. They're not gonna say what I would want them to say. I don't want them to do that. You know, um, I don't want New York University to make a statement on my behalf with regard to this, you know? And frankly, I don't want NYU to make a statement on my behalf in a way that will make me feel a little less queasy about working for NYU, right? I don't I you know, nah, because first of all, I don't think we should feel queasy about the fact that we have to work. Well, we have to work.
Right.
General Baker didn't feel queasy about the fact that he had to work for Ford Motor Company. And he saw no contradiction between going to work for Ford Motor Company and trying to destroy Ford Motor Company. That's a contradiction that I can live in and live with happily, until the material conditions for it disappear as a function of the work that we do,
Right.
right? I'm like, you know, I'm not mad at artists work for museums and galleries because the museums and galleries work for the rich people who collect. And it's cool, and artists need to come to grips with that. And it doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you another one of these people out here who's got to work for some evil motherfucker to make a living. That's all. Okay. And most people are smart enough to not like their bosses
Right.
and to not want their bosses to speak for them. Right. And to not need their bosses to speak for them. To not need their bosses to offer some to ventriloquize their sentiments. So it's okay. Not you know if
Yeah, yeah.
if you've you know if you're under if I believe it's like a horrible misfortune to be given to making visual art, right? It's because you're driven to do it. It's an impulse that you can't help but follow. But look what it puts you in connection with. you know it's sad. It's horrible to be a nerdy kind of person and who wants to read a lot of books, because you're almost sort of driven towards and then you got to deal with bad people all the time, or whatever. But that doesn't make you that's we have to learn how to work through these things, without you know denouncing some individual's morality, or some individual's assertion of a moral position. No, 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 no. Let's consider, the general health of our common ethical practices, you know. And
Yeah,
yeah, Fanon did. It could be said that Fanon or Sylvia Wynter, whom we love and revere, okay, they do try to imagine another idea of the human, and that might be a moment in which we would say, "I love y'all, but maybe it's really beyond the formation of another idea of the human." Maybe the very idea of the human as such is just a genuine problem that we have to get out of. You know, um, maybe the idea of the human is already so fundamentally contaminated by a latent raciality, right? By a latent misogyny, okay, right? By maybe it's just a bad idea. Maybe it can't be saved. Maybe we have to let that go.
I appreciate that provocation. One of the things, so yeah, well, we have you here. I do want to spend a little time because you know we've hinted at it, but we haven't talked much about ethical practice, about thinking about our own anti-colonial practice. And I appreciate the way you say that, right? Because it's not like I think there's a lot of like armchair quarterbacking of like Palestinians, and that falls into the very trap you mentioned too of um, expecting that all of anti-colonial struggle and the weight of that as a concept and a formulation has to fall upon the Palestinian people, and that is a brutal formulation in itself. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't, what are you, what are some of the things you're wrestling in terms of anti-colonial practices as we might think of it here in where we are in the so-called United States?
Well, I mean, this is what, I've been talking about with my friends, trying to think through it for a long time, but especially more intensely over the last couple of weeks. And first of all, I think it's not, well, I mean, I was driving with my partner on the way to where I am right now this morning, and she was like adamantly opposed to the very idea of the question, what should we do? Right? Because it induces somebody, usually some man, to say, okay, here's what we should do, and
Right.
that's already a defeat, you know.
And I'm not trying to ask
Yeah.
you that, to
No,
be
no,
clear,
I
Fred.
know, I
Yeah,
know, I know.
yeah.
I wasn't even. I was just. I just had her in my ear, because I often end up, you know, too happily standing in the playing the role of that man, and I don't want to be that man. Um, but I mean, when she talks about it, she'll say, "Well, Foucault." People ask that question. Foucault just say everything. There's everything to do, you know. Um, and then, but then there's another way in which you just sort of say, well, maybe some small. I know that people feel despair over what seems like the the the, the magnitude of the brutality, the magnitude of the evil. Okay. And I guess I'm starting to think, well, you can work where you are. You have to do work where you are. I live in the United States, which is a brutal settler colony. Okay. And and the brutality of it, the massiveness of it, is that that settler colonial intent pervades every every activity, every sphere of life, every place, everything. And so, whether you want to call it anti-colonial practice or decolonial practice, it's really about recalibrating everyday practices in such a way as to disrupt that colonial intent. So I think about it because I think about it with regard to my job, okay? Because my job is I'm a teacher. And I think, how does the coloniality express itself in the sort of forms and protocols of my job? And what would be the ways to detach and to work against those colonial forms and protocols? So I've got I've got some ideas about that. And what I want to do is talk with some other people about these ideas and see how they can be enacted and refined. I don't think we have to have the answer before we start doing shit. I
Mhm,
think we have to be willing to experiment and get it wrong and then try to fix it.
mhm.
Okay. And I also think that we have to do so, especially in those zones where the colonial intent has become so pervasive that they don't even watch us anymore. Right? Like, they don't come to my classroom to check and make sure that I am adhering to the colonial intent. And they're not particularly interested in the content of my class, because it's not necessarily the content where adherence to the colonial intent is being played out, right? Like, in other words, I have to now come to grips with the fact that I can teach all the Sylvia Wynter and all the Fanon and all the Malcolm X I want, and I might still be adhering to the colonial intent. That it's really not about the content of what you read. Maybe it's about how you read. Maybe it's about how much reading you assign. Maybe it's about grading or not, that maybe there's these, maybe the coloniality is given somewhere other than in the content. Okay. But these are all questions that I want to begin to think about and investigate and experiment with other people, recognizing that there's maybe some interesting leeway that we have in a classroom setting because they're not really watching us. They're really not. Yeah, you could say somebody might annoy you or somebody, and obviously it's a different situation if you're a tenured faculty person rather than an adjunct. So I get that and those, and again, but even that, I shouldn't have to give. I don't want to be in a position of always having to provide a caveat to the stupid shit I just said. I want to be in a room full of my friends so that they can say, no, that shit is stupid. And we can work something out together. That's the point. So
Yeah. Yeah, appreciate that. Let's see. Folks, if you do have questions, drop them in the chat. We can have a little bit more time. Just looking through the comments in the chat to see if there's anything here. Um Let's see this question. Can we say the same for those whose teachings center Palestine, though? So I guess that's a question of is it still is it still colonial if we're centering Palestinian anti-colonial work? Maybe is the question here. Um,
yeah, obviously, c- some content is is maybe a little bit riskier and a little more volatile than others. And I think, but even that also depends upon who's doing the teaching and where they're doing that teaching. I so yeah, I don't want to. I'm not trying to adhere to the blanket statement that I just made. But and then here's the point, right? Okay, then if there are people who are particularly vulnerable when they teach um uh, in a class that is sort of focused on Palestine, then how do we how do we mobilize in order to protect them? How do we create different kinds of pedagogical situations so that they will be less vulnerable? Stuff like that, right? Um, and I don't believe that it's impossible to formulate some strategies for doing that. They might not be perfect strategies and they might not last for all time. They would have to themselves be revised depending upon. See, here's the thing. There's conditions under which we will end up being under attack, okay? And then we'll have to deal with that attack. But what I guess I'm suggesting is that if we begin to engage in more sort of conscious anti-colonial practices in the sort of in, before the fact of the attack, we'll be that much better prepared for the attack when it comes, right? And we'll have some ideas about how to withstand it, okay, and how to, yeah. So, yeah.
Dr. Jared Ball from Morgan State University's question is, can I be down with those class experiments?
Yeah, I would love to. I would be. I'm so. I mean, and there are people that I've already and I'm sure that Professor Ball too. We've already been involved in some of these experiments and experiments with people who are in different universities and maybe outside of the sort of normative university, trying to create other kinds of you know alternative learning spaces. And so I'm not talking about inventing something that we haven't already been doing. I'm saying kind of reclaiming and refining those practices. But yes, I would this is all I want to work on and I want to work with anybody else who wants to work on it. So
Right on. A person just commented that they went to a teaching on Palestine, and while learning what was happening in Palestine, their brain couldn't help but think the same things are happening in Black communities across America. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of resonance, between the two experiences. Obviously, there's some real particularities to I think the Palestinian experience, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of shared history and a lot. I mean, there's a lot of Black nationalists and Black socialists and Black communist figures who have historically been in solidarity with Palestine, and not just solidarity as some expression, but actual exchange of knowledge and practice and thinking and stuff like that too. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that well, first of all, I just think that Black communities in the United States are almost invariably, and have been for a very, very, very long time, they are international communities, and they are internationalist communities, right? Um, and that internationalism manifests itself in ways that are both, let's say, internal to the African diaspora, but that cross the boundary beyond what it is that we would call the African diaspora. So, um, and again, to again, the challenge is always to figure out ways to move beyond the limits of the rhetorical, right? Not to eliminate the rhetorical, not to eliminate the necessity of speaking, because that can't be done and it shouldn't be done, but to engage in practices that are not just about making those again, statements of solidarity. And you know, yeah. So but what when we see things happening in the West Bank and Gaza, yeah, it rings bells, you know, but not just there. There's stuff happening elsewhere in the world, and it's happening not just the Black communities in the U.S., but other communities in the U.S. as well, indigenous communities especially, and so I think it's really important that's another important that the way that question was framed was precisely around this necessity of a kind of double vision, right? That I see there and I see other places too, and that's a more again that's a more refined seeing, and it's an example of the more refined seeing that we need to engage in, you know.
Right on. I'm gonna pull up a couple other things. This was a comment that someone's interested in what happens when the majority of us can't be trusted by the state, and then they don't know where to look because they'd be looking everywhere. And that majority could be real or imagined. Someone else asked, "Is this petite marinage?" I assume this was discussing when you were talking about the practices of the classroom and things like that. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to reflect on either of those.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it would be right to. So what I would say is, with regard to the petit marinage, I don't know if it would be right to just make that absolute kind of direct equivalence. Okay, but let's just say that there's absolutely and definitely there could be and there should be a family, resemblance, and what that means is that it's important for us to study the history of marinage, not just to not just in the interest of claiming some connection to it as a kind of way of exalting one's own personal identity, but rather to say, man, we don't have to invent everything.
Right.
We've got a history. in which we have in which people have worked, against odds that are, pretty objectively greater than the odds that we face. And we can learn something from what it is that we've already done, right? Um, that maybe the mistake was thinking that those kinds of activities weren't necessary anymore. It's like, well, it turns out they are, and you know, and so we learn, we seek out the history of petit marronage um, and look for it everywhere. I mean, that other question was like, well, yeah, they don't trust us. They already don't trust us, and they already look for us everywhere. We're under constant surveillance. Um, Maybe one of the things is maybe we need to look for ourselves, a little bit more. I kind of feel like sometimes they have a better idea of what we can do than we do. You know, so you know.
Yeah, I'll say, just one thing with regards to that and to connect back to Palestine is that I do think one of the things that and I realize some people get conspiratorial about this and I disagree with them, but one of the things that folks could say or have said about Israel is that it had perfect defense structures, it had perfect security apparatuses, it had, perfected surveillance, and yet and still they were caught completely off guard in terms of a lot of the actions that were taken by Palestinians in the early phases of this resistance. And I think that if nothing else, that should point us to the fact that yes, we should be very wary of all this surveillance, and we should be wary of the surveillance that we subject ourselves to with these things and with what we're on right now
Mhm.
and all of that. um but also I think it's important for people not to let the existence of the surveillance state deter them from taking careful but appropriate action, and yeah.
Well, the questions regarding what Israeli intelligence knew and didn't know is an interesting one. Um, and my sense of it could be totally wrong. Is that they didn't know when or where or exactly how it was going to happen, but they knew it was going to happen because they've been imposing the conditions that made it absolutely inevitable that it would happen. Okay. Um, and I think it's similar with regard to our situation here in the US, I mean, but what we've got is uncertainty and indeterminacy with regard to the where, the how, the when, you know, and that indeterminacy is our is one of our advantages, you know. But the fact of the matter is, they know it's going to happen, um, and so they surveil heavily, and they've got extraordinarily, they got techniques and powers that are meant to suppress it when it happens. The suppression will never be total, but they do. But the point is that well, look, man. I mean, I the optimism to which I subscribe is completely is out of necessity. Like, in order to fight, in order to play, I gotta believe that we can win and that we have what it takes to win. Okay. So, you know, um, and it's what makes it possible to try to look closely enough at at the forces that are arrayed against us to be able to understand how they work, you know, um, and 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 at the same time to know that even however daunting those forces might appear to be, we still have what it takes to 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 defeat those forces. So that's I believe that. It, I will stop believing that when I die, you know, and I won't need to believe it anymore when I'm gone, you know. But but I but I if I stopped believing that, then I think that I would die, you know. So um I we can win. I know we can win.
Right on. So Matt Deitch asked the question. Shout out to Matt. Matt is an organizer that goes back to the March for Our Lives and has engaged in significant politicization and radicalization since then as well. And he said today there are many, many walkouts happening. I've organized so many walkouts and years ago pivoted to calls for walkouts and teach-ins to be paired so that the action could become a momentum organization builder. I'm curious on additional insights that can develop this tactic further regarding student protests. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Fred, but it's a good question.
Well, I got one thought, um, but I guess it's kind of a long thought. um, I'll see if I can try to make it concise. And it gets back to that question of content, and in a classroom, let's say. Okay. Um, I've always I began to believe because of my interest in jazz and interest in the music. And I always had this kind of idealistic notion that I wanted my classes to be like being in a band, you know, that I wanted them to operate that way. And I never was able to do it, never was able to pull it off. It's done, I don't know. But I began to consider that there's this other element to it too, which is that I kind of feel like every class that is about the class, that the class is a kind of it's an event, it's this sort of organized, sort of temporally framed, you know, a bit, sort of occasion for gathering, right? And that the class is always about the class. The class is always about how do we get together to do this? What are the protocols? How do we organize ourselves in order to study this stuff, right? So it's always like a little experiment in social organization. Um, and and whatever the content of the class, it's always about the class. Whether it's this experiment in social organization is operative, whether you're teaching about opera or Palestine, it doesn't matter. Um, and um, and there might be ways to align the question of content with the question of form. Okay. But that question of form, or even, or better yet, a kind of deformation, right? Right. Um, that's that's always operative. It's always has to be foregrounded, right? It can't just be hidden. It's got to always be made clear. Okay. And so another place, so every goddamn class should be an experiment in anti-colonial practice at the level of its organization. Okay. And if you're engaged in that experiment, then I always kind of felt like, we're the ones who kind of feel like thinking and studying is important for what we do and for who we are. So, so kind of not having the class always seemed to me to be like I'd rather like go on a hunger strike than not have class, you know? Like I got more of a commitment to the experimental social organization of the class than to the integrity of my own body. You see what I'm trying to say? So
Yeah.
so I'm like, like in the H blocks, right? Like Bobby said, they went on hunger strike, but they didn't stop their Irish classes. You see what I'm saying? I mean, like I kind of and this raises another issue, right? Regarding the question of what it means to walk out, what it means to go on strike. Okay. And I feel like over the last few years, maybe most emphatically, and again, if I mention a name, it's not to suggest that this person might be endorsing any of what I'm saying on any level, but I think one of the important contributions in Saidiya Hartman's recent work is she's given us a way of refining, kind of in the wake of Du Bois and maybe in the wake of Walter Benjamin, our understanding of the general strike. And one way to think about it is, what's the relation between petit marronage and the general strike, right? Okay. What we like Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, he's saying, well, somewhere early on in the Civil War, enslaved people went on a general strike that basically tipped the scales in the favor of the Union. And it makes you want to go, well, did they begin the general strike at that moment? Or were there always these forms of labor action, if you will, right?
Hmm.
And I understand all the various reasons why people want to not say that the slave was a worker, but just this once, I'll try to see if I can get away with it just because of what it might generate, right? Were there forms of labor insurgency, right, that we could talk about under the rubric of petit marronage, but that we might get even more out of it if we talk about it under the rubric of a general strike, right? This is It's a complicated thing, and it's something to talk about another time, maybe. But all I'm trying to suggest, in relation to that question, okay, is we should just always be trying to radicalize what it is we do in the classroom and embracing that as an experimental space, right? So that when a crisis emerges, when an intensification of the brutalities of genocide and coloniality, when those things emerge in ways that require that we pay attention to them, even though they extend a long ass history, it better prepares us to respond in the attention that we pay, right? We should have already been working on this shit, is what I'm trying to
Right.
say.
Right.
Because these motherfuckers are killing people in fucked up ways all over the place every day.
Yeah.
Okay. And we should be working against that shit every day. Okay. That's not to lessen or to reduce the intensity of the current brutality. It's in fact to better prepare us for the intensity of the next brutality. Because the motherfuckers are working on that right now. Okay.
Hmm.
Oh.
Hmm. Thank you, Fred. I'm gonna pull up. So I'll do two more, and then we'll close it out because I do want to. Oh, why are there balloons on my screen? I'm just trying to figure out this thing. All right. So this one, I think we can kind of deal with pretty quickly. So this was just a question. Palestinian comrades have told them that the Zionist state has too much power for us to afford just talking amongst ourselves. We need to bring people in, not cut them off. What do you think of that, Fred? And then I'll pull up the other one and we can just kind of do both and then um, say our grateful goodbyes. So Kwesi asked, um, would you say that we are witnessing the occupation and genocide of Palestinians is an antagonism at the level of ontology or simply on the terrain of geopolitical conflict? So there's those two, the ontology versus geopolitical conflict, and then the other one was about bringing folks in and not cutting folks off. And I'm sorry, chat, we won't take any more, but we'll respond to these and close it out.
Well, I just say shit very briefly and probably therefore cryptically, and but I'm happy to try to expand on what I think with Quasi and with the other person whose name I didn't get, if they want to email me or something, but
Yeah,
Arturo.
Arturo. Yeah.
I don't believe that talking amongst ourselves is ever predicated on some exclusionary idea of who constitutes ourselves. When we talk upon, even when we talk amongst ourselves, I believe that we do it with and within let's say an evangelical imperative. Okay. And I guess maybe what I mean when I say talk amongst ourselves is that we just don't need to. Okay, so here's an example. And I know Robin Kelly said something like this weekend too. So I'm echoing him as I always do, at least when I'm close to saying something right, at least, is that sometimes when we say that we want to reach a larger audience, we are also involved in this process in which we take up the terms and conditions of the discourse within which that larger audience operates. So, for instance, we might say something like, when the when when Israel bombs Gaza at this particular moment, they do so against these in blatant violation of international law. For me, what it means to talk amongst ourselves is to be able to operate within what I think is an absolutely necessary and absolutely unavoidable critique of the very idea and of the foundations of international law. Okay. International law and settler coloniality are handmaidens of one another. Okay.
Hmm.
Right. And so, but see, the thing is, we need to talk amongst ourselves about that, because talking with them about that means acceding to the mythologies of international law. Right. So 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 I guess when I say talk amongst ourselves, I don't mean it to sort of create a boundary in terms of who we talk to. I mean that it establishes a set of protocols about how we talk. Okay. And so that's a rough answer to that. And then the second answer would be, it'll be more cryptic, you know. I believe in the absolute importance of the sort of heuristic value of the distinction between antagonism and conflict. Like, I think it's a totally productive distinction. It helps us to think. But I also believe it's heuristic, right? And I believe that the distinction between antagonism and conflict ought not blind us to the fact that every geopolitical conflict, right, is a function of the brutalities of ontological thinking. Okay. So that's the way I would put it. you know. And again, that's kind of hypercryptic and insular, but I'm kind of having a feeling that Quasi understands what I'm getting at, even if he might disagree with it. So
Right on. Fred, I just want to thank you so much for doing this, for coming on, having this conversation. Shout out to everybody in the chat for the great questions, the great responses. I think that added something for sure to this discussion today, because people brought up a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have asked, and I think that those are important questions that people have. And yeah, Fred, I just wanna thank you again.
well, thank you, Jared. Now I just want to say, maybe I was a little wary about coming on because I knew the form is structured so that it puts me in a position of answering questions, even if I
Right.
ain't got no answers. But I also wanted to, but I appreciate the invitation, because for me it was a chance to. What I really want to say is I don't know if any of what I'm saying is right. I believe it when I'm saying it. I'm happy to find out that it was wrong or limited. The only way that I could do that is if people who are here, I want to talk with y'all, not to y'all, but with y'all about it, some kind of way. Um, so if you're in New York, or you got an email address or whatever, I'd love to find ways to keep talking about all this with y'all, so we can work on this stuff together. So that'll be much more important and valuable than anything that I said today. So, all right. So, but thank you for the chance
Thank
to
you.
just to get something, yeah, to keep it going. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again. All right, folks. This has been another live stream from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live. Thanks to you all, and we'll see you next time.